In the grim darkness of the far future, there are forgotten stories. Welcome to Alex Gordon Audios. Welcome back to Alex Gordon Audios. The Great Crusade has reached the edge of Terra's cradle, the Asteroid Belt, where humanity's oldest enemies have feasted on enslaved survivors for millennia. Eddard Fendragon, the Emperor's firstborn son and master strategist, leads the First Legion in a lightning assault on Ceres, heart of the cohorts slaver empire. What begins as orbital bombardment and drop-pod insertion escalates into a brutal tunnel war through gravity-warped catacombs where Astartes' cohorts discover the true horror of Xenos cruelty. Millions of human slaves, broken in body and soul, children used as living weapons, and ancient war beasts mind-shackled to fight their liberators. When the Primarch himself teleports into the dwarf planet's core to breach an impregnable gate, he uncovers a vault of Dark Age secrets and awakens a nightmare older than the Imperium. 100,000-ton Shoggoth, relic of a forgotten war, erupts from stasis with one goal: consume the Emperor's sword. In the deepest darkness, Eddard Fendragon will forge a legend, mastering a technique so devastating his own legion must flee to survive. This is the Battle of Ceres and the birth of the Imperium's Black Knight.
Chapter 18. The Battle of Ceres. Location: the Palace of Malgdantu on Ceres. Date: 812.M30. Malgroth lounged within the depths of its Sporkin's dwelling. The great void coral palace was one of the 79 that dotted the harsh frozen surface of Cher, one for each of the 79 clans of Quhrel who ruled the Belt of Sol. It was a perfect domain for Malgroth's kin, barren and distant from the system's star, minerals rich and filled with tunnels and caverns, perfect for slaves and spawns. The Quhrel were an ancient species with a history spanning millions of years. In that time, empires and species had risen and fallen. All throughout, the Quhrel had waxed and waned, surviving and existing in the dark, fetid parts of the galaxy, like the molds they were distantly related to. During galactic dark ages, they prospered and fed upon the remnants of broken civilizations. Now was one of those times of plenty. The meatlings of terror had been broken by their automata, and the endless empire of the Crystal Children had been dragged screaming into the Nether. As the fires of those twin apocalyptic conflicts cooled, the Quhrel had slithered into the former crown worlds of the Terran meatlings. The meatlings bred quickly, and even the greatest cataclysm in their history had done little to quell their numbers. Lacking the legions of iron that had once defended them, they were easy prey for Malgroth's kin. For as long as the story murals recorded, the Quhrel had been the masters of breaking lesser species to their will. The enslavement and exploitation of other sentients had long ago been perfected by Malgroth's ancestors, and the continuation of such a practice was quite useful. Terran meatlings, in particular, proved to be the virtually perfect slave species. It amused the Quhrel that the species that had once claimed dominion over the stars proved such excellent fodder for their industries, agriculture, and subservience. Terrans bred quickly, even in the most odious conditions. They could survive and thrive on the most basic scraps. They could even be manipulated to turn on each other for better pickings of refuse to squash rebellion. Unlike the orcs or other fast-breeding races, they could be easily broken into obedient slaves. Terran tissue was also quite nutritious, and their warp signature seemed to attract the attention of the Four from the beyond, making sacrifices of their nether touched an excellent source of boons. They truly were the ideal slave species. Malgroth itself was waited on by 100 fanatically loyal meatlings who all competed for the honor of having their cerebral spinal fluid drank by their master. The Spore clan of Malg owned 89,602,819 Terran slaves, with a few 100,000 more used for sustenance or materials. Form its Xeno perspective. Malgroth knew, without a doubt, Terrans were inferior livestock, and that the enslavement and consumption of them would continue until every last one of them had been used up. Malgroth knew this because they would not be the first species to experience such a fate under the Q'rell's use. What Malgroth did not know was that the millennia of human enslavement and consumption was about to violently end, or that it was about to pay for its crimes with its life as a barrage of fire reduced its palace to ash. By their very nature voidship, lance weaponry strike first in a battle. This proved true as the first broadsides of hyper-focused energy burned through Ceres' defense field and unleashed hell upon the world below. Battle tank-sized bolts of light turned millennia worth of carefully grown void coral into a plasmatic slurry of its component atoms. The palace of Malgdantu had proved an optimum first target of the First Legion. The isolated equatorial plateau would provide baseline information on the effectiveness of the fleet's weapons. Scans also indicated the vast bulk of life forms matching human biological characteristics were located beneath the proto-planet's surface. The strike would decapitate enemy leadership without causing unnecessary harm to the enslaved humans. Lance fire lacerated the kilometer-high structure, leaving angular cuts that turned the thick layer of frost lacquered onto it into great clouds of vapor. Entire sections of the macrostructure were peeled away from the main spire and teetered precariously. As the vivisected structure started to settle from the devastation inflicted by Imperial energy weapons, the fleet's macro-cannon shells slammed into it. Megatons of explosive force shattered the palace into frozen shards that flitted through the void, affected partially by the rapidly decaying artificial gravity of the palace, forming a hauntingly beautiful spectacle of crystal snow floating between earthquake-inducing impacts. In less than 10 minutes, the once prideful center of Xeno-tyranny and all its occupants had been utterly destroyed by the First Legion. Location: the Tai Pridwen. Date: 812.M30. The first assault was a resounding success. The Xeno fortress was reduced to ash without issue, and the next phase of the battle had begun. Like the nest of vermin, it was the protoplanet had been stirred into a frenzy. Defensive shields shimmered into being over the remaining spires. These were not the faint containment fields meant to simulate an atmosphere and protect from cosmic debris, but barriers of eldritch energy and distorted space-time. At Eddard's command, the fleet opened fire on the other targetable fortress. Three folded under the bombardment, their barriers not solidified enough to withstand the Imperium's wrath. The other 20 were luckier, and the shields shimmered with sickly light as they halted the bombardment. Even so, Armageddon rained down upon the barriers, straining them and preventing any orbital defenses from being fired. This did not prevent swarms of xenofighter craft from pouring out of their hives. The fields reacted to momentum and would not block low-velocity objects from entering or exiting it. Confirming what he had expected, the first Primarch gave the much-anticipated order to his legion. Ready drop pods for deep strike insertion. Thousands of legionnaires entered their drop pods and prepared to be launched like living ordnance down onto Ceres. 100 or so battle brothers of the 8th Formation boarded their strike craft and took formation as squad leaders of auxiliar-piloted fighter squadrons. They would defend the fleet and their battle brothers from the oncoming Xeno horde. Bolts of energy and mass-reactive shells spilled into the void as the fleet's defenses came to life. Tens of thousands of Xenofighters had already poured into the void and were beginning to open fire with energy weapons. Even in massive volleys, the scorching Xeno weapons could not threaten Imperial void shields. Still, they fired, all while coalescing towards the Typridwen. Similar to the Astartes drop pods that thundered past them, the Xenos sought to decapitate the enemy. Not a single one got close enough to even touch the Gloriana-class's void shield. Deadly storms of flak fire and masterful pilots of the 8th Formation ripped them out of the void. It was now when the nature of the Xeno fighters were revealed by Imperial strike craft observation. The Xeno fighter craft were not craft at all, but individual specimen of the enemy. At about 8 foot long and sprouting many foul protrusions, the horrific bilaterally symmetrical beings flew through the void on some unknown ether with fan-like wings. In its tendrils, they held queer-directed energy weapons that lashed out with vivid bolts that tore through the armor of any strike craft unlucky enough to be hit. Location: Ceres, Xeno, Spire 5. Date: 812.M30. As the orbital battle between strikecraft and Xeno intensified, the first drop pods slammed into Ceres' surface. Control rockets had directed and slowed the pods to safely pass through the Xeno Palace's force field. Hundreds of drop pods smashed into and around each spire. With practiced efficiency, the Astartes exited their transports and secured the perimeter around their craft. The vast majority of the drop pods had landed within 100 meters of the base of the spire. A few struck directly into it, though. Those battle brothers had the somewhat more arduous duty of setting up internal kill zones to occupy and distract defenders while the main force moved in. Once the landing forces had decided it was reasonably safe, a signal was transmitted back to the fleet. Specialized Astartes from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 7th. Formations were then deployed with their war gear and vehicles. 20 independent armies of Astartes, each numbering in the thousands, formed up. Columns of the newly manufactured Gen 1 Rhino transports and Predator tanks deployed. Squads formed up into companies and companies into chapters. 3rd Formation scout craft quickly moved to scan the Xeno structure and access enemy forces and access points. Orbital scans indicated each spire was an entry point into a sprawling catacomb system of both human and Xeno origin. Taking these 20 spires would provide access to the proto-planet's core. The 3rd Formation's initial reports indicated the spires themselves were sparsely populated. more akin to a mix of pleasure palace and fortress than a proper city. As of now, the majority of their defenders were engaging in the orbital battle, but more would soon be spilling out of the planet's crust once the Astartes assault was noticed. This was the key point of the battle for Ceres. The First Legion had to take the spires quickly and butcher the Xenos before they could mount a defense. The location marked by Imperial tacticians as Spire 5 was the first to be breached by the Legion. It was one of the larger Xenos structures, and its entrance was a broad avenue leading to a semi-organic looking aperture. The other spires tended to have high-up tubular access points, with a few larger ones that seemed to be loading dock equivalents. The design was perfect for armored vehicles, and a unit of 4th Formation tanks and transports carrying 5th Formation Astartes charged the gate. Once they were within a few hundred meters, the reason for the atypical entrance point became apparent. The hab-block-sized aperture opened up, and 24 hulking beasts rampaged out of it. Oily, tentacled creatures, each rivaling a rhino in size. Festooned with brutal armor and blades attached to their extremities, the monster was ready for battle. On each specimen back was its xeno-handler. The curl-grasping tendrils each held some sort of energy weapon, and they were protected by an armored howdah. Fully utilizing the mobility advantage provided by their quadruped ape-like stance, the creatures charged the Astartes' armored division. With practiced certainty, the rhino transports moved themselves and their cargo out of the creature's reach and behind their predator siblings, all while firing into the pack of monsters with their storm bolters. Taking up frontline positions, the predators blasted away at the war beasts. Even under a hail of bolt shells and autocannon blasts, the creatures did not falter. Their armor rippled with oily light that muted the destructive power being unleashed against them. Even so, the great volume of mass reactive shells filling the air managed to rip through the Xeno armor and explode inside the war beasts. Instead of bleeding or breaking like a fully natural creature, the war beast's flesh oozed over the injury like a grotesque fluid. One of the more massive specimens reared up and brought its armored forelimbs down on a predator's turret. Its rider's weapons unleashed etheric tendrils of electricity that crackled and lashed out at the tank's armor. Barely dodging the crackling power claws bonded to the war beast's flesh as it sunk through the turret's armor, the tank's lead gunner aimed its autocannon into the beast's chest. With an explosive crack, the round blasted through the creature's chest cavity and detonated as it reached the beast's spine equivalent and back armor. A mixture of organic and metal shrapnel spewed out of its back and reduced the war beast's rider to a fine paste. Instantly, the war beast pulled away as if the predator's hull scalded it. Backing away with twitchy movements, the creature slumped forward, its head pressed against the frozen rock of Ceres. It took a moment for the tank's crew to decipher the alien body language of what they had assumed was a brutish, gene-crafted animal. It was bowing, a near-universal mark of supplication and respect. A moment later, the grey, clammy flesh of the xenobeast started to slaughter off of it. Wounds from both this battle and previous ones ripped open. Scars faded into being and became gaping injuries as the Xeno died before their eyes. The patterns, even upon such an alien form, were unmistakable. brands and lash marks that always accompanied slavery. This was no animal, but a sentient being, forced into violence and servitude that was so severe even death could not be an escape. Some foul warpcraft of Xeno-heresy forced the Xeno slave to keep living and was dispelled with its master's death. Showing the initiative and understanding that had earned him his command, Tank Sergeant Hawkwood quickly voxed the other tank commanders. Aim for the Xeno riders. They are the source of the beast's resilience. They are just as much slaves as the mortals toiling below. Euthanize them efficiently. Reacting with startling speed, the 10 tanks of Hawkwood's division gained firing lines on the Quhrel riders and pulverized them with concentrated fire. The armor and shields of their diocese did little to stifle the vengeance of mankind. Soon all that was left of the 12 slave Xenos were malformed skeletons, quickly covering with void frost. A marker beacon for the Xenos' biologies was deployed on them, and the tanks advanced upon the gate. Bolts of energy from turrets hidden in the void coral flew down upon them. A quick hail of bolter fire quickly silenced them, and the gaping entrance to the spire awaited. It appeared the Xenos had attempted to shut the bastion once they realized the battle had turned against them. A few stray bolt shells had turned the fleshy aperture into a wound in the spire's side. Assembling quickly, the Astartes prepared to march into the spire. A cohort of Astartes, numbering in at 5,000 battle brothers, along with armored transports, tanks, flyers, attack bikes, mech suits, specialty forces, and support Astartes, prepared to enter the spire. Doom and destruction was coming. The Xenos and liberation in life or peace in death was coming to their victims. They were the emperors, angels of death, and they would know no fear. Location: interior of Spire 5. Date: 812.M30. 30 minutes since Cohort 5 made planetfall. The interior of the spire reminded Sergeant Hawkwood of ancient spiral fossils he had seen once displayed in a museum. The entrance opened up onto a gently sloping spiral road that traced the edge of the spiral. Going left would take you deeper into the spiral, and going right would take you higher up. A veritable horde of twittering cyber-altered task servitors, or cats, were released into the dark interior, each equipped with a scanner suite and programmed to venture and scan anywhere not mapped by the Legion. The Predators took formation and prepared to descend into the spire. Scans indicated the spiral road was composed of the same void coral that made up the rest of the spire. Yet it was more worn and damaged than anywhere else. It occurred to Hawkwood this was not natural erosion. It was an effect of thousands, if not millions of slaves wearing away at it as they were moved by their masters. Suddenly, those masters descended from above. Like twisted parodies of bats, the Xenos flew from the shadowed heights of the spire they dwelled in. The same twisted lighting that had been unleashed earlier by the Xeno energy weapons crackled down, lashing at vehicles and marching Astartes in great gouts of cancerous energy. Turret-mounted weapons opened fire on the descending Xenos. Infantry Astartes deployed from their transports and joined the firefight. Bolt shells, Volkite beams, and a few more exotic projectiles filled the dark, cavernous spire. The Quhrel had realized very quickly, with the destruction of their vanguard beasts, that they were disadvantaged on the field of battle. Guile, ambush, and as the Astartes quickly learned, psychological warfare would be the stratagem of the Xenos. The psychological warfare in question was discovered as a squad of jump infantry rocketed up into the darkness to strike the Xenos in flight. They were the first to see the next part of the alien attack. The squad captain voxed the entire cohort in a brief warning of what he saw. Inbound bombardment, biological weapons likely. 10 meters from Sergeant Hawkwood's tank, something splattered into the helix road, numerous spotter lights fixated on the pulped mass of tissue. It twitched and slowly pulled itself to its feet. Even after a lifetime of slavery and the catastrophic trauma of impact, the emaciated form of a human child was still recognizable. Despite not being warp-touched and firmly protected inside the Predator, he commanded Hawkwood felt the warp's corruption ooze off the child thing. Some curse, akin to what had kept the war beasts alive, animated the corpse, or what had seemed to be a corpse. Its dented skull turned to face the nearest Astartes, who was slowly approaching it with bolter ready. The child's mouth opened and vocal cords raw from screaming spoke. The dialect barely resembled Gothic, and it was more of a bloody croak than a sentence. But the Astartes could understand it still. "Make it stop! Please make it stop!" As it spoke, the child lurched towards the Astartes. Puppeteered by some inscrutable force, it flailed its limbs uselessly at the Space Marine. Kept alive by foul sorcery, the child's mind was intact enough to suffer, while its body was used to attack who should have been its savior. With no hesitation, pity, or remorse, the Astartes fired his bolter and extinguished the last traces of the child's half-life. The battle continued, and so did the bombardment. Hundreds of mutilated children rained down upon the Astartes. They were terror weapons, meant to demoralize and horrify attackers. The Astartes only noticed them when they got underfoot, or could be easily dispatched. That is not to say they did not have an effect on the battle brothers of the First Legion. A cold, brutal fury similar to their gene father's own ignited in each and every Astartes witness to the atrocity. The Xenos would be purged with ruthless efficiency once the First Legion had finished its duty. The only evidence of the slaver scum's existence would be within Imperial archives. The battle raged, and a handful of Astartes were slain under concentrated fire, while thousands of Xenos were ripped from the sky. The cohort's lead chaplain opened up a general vox signal and addressed the Astartes army as one. "Our armor is contempt. Our shield is disgust. Our sword is hatred." As one, the cohort responded with the hypno-indoctrinated response. "In the Emperor's name, let none survive." For nearly an hour, the 5th cohort of the First Legion butchered the Xenos. The Curul were naturally physically tough, and further augmented by sorcery and technology. The cold of the void or ocean depths did little to inconvenience them. Even so, bolt shell reduced them to pulped slurries, and volkites burned them to ash. The puppeteered children could be dispatched with the destruction of the brainstem and pose little threat to the Emperor's angels. Even the Xeno energy weapons required several seconds of sustained fire from multiple sources to kill an Astartes. It occurred to Hawkwood the Xenos' weaponry might have been designed to maim and torture slaves or beasts, not cutting through, centimeter-thick ceramite. The few straggling Xenos were killed by roving squads of 6th Formation CQC infantry who had been supporting beleaguered 5th Formation fire teams. All were slain except one, a particularly large and gaudily decorated specimen whose left wing and graspers had been blown off. A faint mewling escaped the Quhrel occasionally, and it attempted to drag itself out of the ring of Astartes that circled it. An armored kick to its injuries dissuaded it each time. Hawkwood's tank company was close by and watched the captured creatures meet its fate. It seemed the infantry had been ordered to capture any enemy commanders if possible. The reasoning became readily available when an Astartes in the trappings of the Librarius approached the Xeno. The Quhrel sensed what was coming, and its efforts to escape redoubled. Witchfire streamed from the librarian's eyes, and his psychic hood crackled with warp lighting. The sigils on the Psyker's armor marked him as Telepathica Librarian, a specialist in ripping open the minds of the enemy and twisting the perception of the weak. The librarian telekinetically restrained the creature, a mist of warp frost coating its limbs, while he chanted psi mantras to ground himself and focus his powers. All but the most psychically dull could sense what happened next, like an adder sinking its fangs into its prey. The librarian's mind struck the Xenos. The creature thrashed and squealed as knowledge, secrets, and its very thoughts were ripped out of it and analyzed by the librarian. Centuries' worth of Xeno memories were sifted through, and the most important details were plucked away. The librarian was thankful, despite the Xenos' appearance. Its neurology was not too radically different from humans, and deciphering the memories was fairly easy. Tactical information was acquired, and basic knowledge of the Xenos' language and communication methods. A small pack of calligraphers and vox servitors were disgorged from the transport the librarian had exited. Electrical bursts erupted from the librarian's hood and arced over to specially designed receptors attached to the servitors. Knowledge torn from the Xeno's mind was injected into the lobotomized cyborgs. It was recorded perfectly by the servitors and voxed in data bursts to the orbiting fleet, who then analyzed it. Drained of its knowledge, the quivering Xeno was released from the librarian's telekinetic grip. A brutal thrust with a force sword finished the broken Quhrel. The tattered remnants of its soul burned in witchfire. The cohorts. Lord Commander ordered a detachment of 300 Marines to clear out the top of the spire, and then ensure the security of the landing site and spire base. Spire 5 would be the beachhead the Imperium needed. Armed with new knowledge that quickly circulated through the cohort and new orders from the fleet, the rest of the 5th cohort advanced into the depths of Ceres. Down and down they went, the helix road showing no signs of ending until they were nearly 3 kilometers below the planet's surface. Eventually, it emptied out into a massive underground cavern. Stretching as far as the Astartes sensors could detect, the cavern was roughly cross-shaped, with the helix road coiling down from the spire shaft that formed the cross's junction. This was an entry point to a great subterranean highway that connected the spires, mines, and slave pits of Ceres. Carved from solid bedrock by ancient humans and widened and modified for the Xenos' insidious purpose. Sergeant Hawkwood for a brief moment wondered if a Titan equivalent could be in these tunnels. They were certainly big enough to comfortably hold a smaller one, or a night mech. He doubted it. Such a weapon would have already been used in the conflict. These tunnels were the size they were to allow easy transport of minerals and millions of slaves. New orders came in. The tank company Hawkwood was part of would lead the scouring and conquest of the northern route of the highway. The cohort would be subdivided into 4 elements that would spread out and claim the subterranean passages for the Imperium. A senior chapter master would each lead one, while the battle master would coordinate and oversee the occupation from the quickly assembling base camp in the Xenos spire. The 5th cohort marched forth into the depths of Ceres. Each cohort forth formed an unstoppable tide that poured through the tunnel. Like a wave of cleansing fire, they blasted through numerous crucial blockades and defensive positions. Recon squads occasionally splintered off into mining crevices that dotted the cavern's walls. Most of the mines they explored were long abandoned, littered with the bones of long-dead slaves. A few held work gangs of humans and Xenos, utterly broken in mind, body, and soul. The slaves had to be ordered at gunpoint to leave the mines and head towards the base camp, quickly assembling at the spire. They would be useful labor until refugee ships could arrive to pick them up. The cohort's main divisions butchered through the tunnel at a steady pace. Their orders were to meet up with any friendlies who had entered from different spires. This happened to Hawkwood's semi-cohort a few hours into the tunnel battle. A horde of Xenos and their war beasts had tried to fortify a segment of the cavern into a makeshift bunker. The Xenos had the terrible luck to be assaulted by 2 different Astartes forces simultaneously, forced to subdivide themselves to face the twin encroaching forces. They were easily ripped apart. When the Predator's cogitators notified him, friendlies were in the area. Hawkwood ensured his crew was careful with their volleys. Avoiding friendly fire has always been a priority on the battlefield. Eventually, the twin forces met in the center of the Xeno encampment. Commanding officers exchanged pleasantries and information. The friendlies were a mixed formation chapter from Cohort 9. Plans were made to work together to clear a side tunnel the mixed chapter had discovered. Right as the joint operation prepared to roll out, a massive planet quake shook the cavern. Stone cracked, and baseline humans would have been thrown to the ground. After a few seconds of shaking, it stopped. The tunnel settled, and thankfully, no debris larger than a human head fell from the ceiling. As the Astartes grounded themselves, a simple message blipped through the Vox. The 2nd Legion has joined the battle. Location: outer orbit of Ceres. Date: 812.M30. 4 hours since the 1st Legion made planetfall. The void was alight. Weapon fire from thousands of barrels poured from the Imperial fleet. Lances, macro cannons, firing both material and plasma shells, pelted the surface of the slaver world. The grand shields of the Xenos protected most of their spires, but another 6, with no deployed Astartes inside towers, were reduced to rubble by the bombardment. Mass destruction, while certainly an effect of the attack, was not its goal. Eddard Fendragon had wagered Xeno vessels were hidden across and below the dwarf planet's surface. The Quhrel fleet stationed in the Asteroid Belt was fast assembling and approaching. It was forming up into a single massive armada in hopes of challenging the First Legion fleet. Having a second fleet disgorged from Ceres would prove a tactical nightmare. So the bombardment continued, all while dropships rained down, providing armor and supplies to the advancing Astartes within the planet. Eddard watched on the grand tactical map as new information poured in, formed from memories stolen by the Librarius and real-time tactical data. It allowed the Primarch to observe and coordinate the battle. A wave of green dots on the map representing allies slowly pushed the Xenos deeper and deeper into the planet. The Legion formed an ever-tightening noose, forcing the enemy into less territory. The battle would only get harder from here. The planet's depths had time to attempt to fortify, and any survivors of the hastily created defenses would further bolster the Xenos. This could not turn into a siege battle. The Astartes needed to crush the Quhrel in one solid push. It seemed something located deep within the planet was the center of the Xeno fortifications. Records supplied by Malcador's agents indicated it was some sort of Golden Age communication nexus. Taking it would be difficult, but not impossible. The deployed Legion would encircle and pressure it, forcing them to divide their forces. Then Eddard would lead the first cohort to breach the defenses and decapitate the enemy leadership. The First Legion landing forces were doing their duties well, but Eddard would not leave the orbital war until his brother arrived. Small escort swarms from the Belt fleet were already harrying the First Legion fleet. Spread out over the dwarf planet in bombardment formation, the fleet was not in a state to handily win the oncoming engagement. They would, but at too high of a cost. This is where the Second Legion's duties would come in. They would soon arrive and strike down the Xeno fleet, allowing the First Legion to continue and win the ground war. The Second Legion should have arrived earlier to prevent this situation. Eddard could telepathically sense some of his fleet captains starting to wonder if moving into a more defensive situation was advisable. Yet even as the Xeno Armada got closer and closer to firing range, Eddard held firm. He trusted his brother and had a strong, possibly psychically based hunch of what Alechogavia was planning. Those suspicions were realized as an urgent astropathic message blared through the First Legion fleet. All it said was, "Hold fast." On all channels, Eddard ordered his fleet to brace for impact and swore internally to himself. The Xeno fleet was bunched up, all desperate to strike the invaders and help save their property of Ceres. Thousands of strange Xeno ships and individual Quhrel massed together and prepared to attack the fleet. A few seconds later, 2/3 of the fleet would be reduced to ash and plasma. The Second Legion's fleet arrived into the battle. No, into the enemy fleet itself, while moving at a disturbingly high percentage of light speed. Executing a maneuver that had been labeled extremely dangerous during the Golden Age, and barely theoretically possible in the Age of Strife the Second Legion struck. Alechogavia used his tremendous intellect and skill in voidcraft to perform a technique ancient void admirals called Einstein's Fist. His entire fleet, under his careful orders and calculations, had arrived at near light speed. Precise manipulation of the fleet's grav and shield systems created a pseudo-bubble of normal void conditions around the fleet, as its plasma drives accelerated them to relativistic speeds in a matter of moments. After a few minutes of this travel, the vessels rapidly deaccelerated through auxiliary thrusters and further gravitational manipulation right on target. The end result was the Second Legion, an Imperial fleet, leaving Martian orbit and arriving in Ceres orbit after only a few minutes of travel. The fleet was cloaked in a wave of plasma, as the accelerating had caused any matter encountered in transit to undergo a fusion reaction, detonating into a cloud of energy and radiation. Additionally, the sheer momentum of the fleet caused space/time itself to bend and twist, forming a near fold in space-time as the Imperium tried to cope with the sudden creation and dissolution of a truly massive gravity well. So when the Second Legion and Imperial fleets arrived into the massed Xeno Armada, they did so, cloaked in simultaneous nuclear detonations and riding an artificial gravitational wave. The cataclysmic amount of energy released was carefully funneled by the positioning of the arriving ships, protecting the Imperial fleet while wreaking devastating upon the Xeno fleet. Annihilated instantly, the Xeno counter-assault was broken. Gravity waves rocked the fleet like an oceanic tide. Massive fissures ripped open in Ceres' crust. Some of the remaining unbreached or unbroken towers collapsed under the artificial tectonic stress. Eddard mused that sending his brother data of the battle had allowed Alexios' genius to figure out a way to aim the gravity wave that efficiently. The First Legion fleet watched with a mix of shock and awe as the wave of annihilation spread out and the newly arrived fleet took up battle positions. Quickly subdividing the Second Legion and Imperial Armada formed into hunter groups, each led by an Astartes admiral, tutored by the second Primarch. They spread through the Asteroid Belt, crushing any resistance and bringing the maze of rock and void scrap under Imperial compliance. Data, tactical information, and more were rapidly exchanged between the fleets, and Eddard was confident the void was under Imperial control. Turning a part of his attention to the tactical map, he was relieved to learn there had been no fallout in the tunnels. They were deep and stable enough to protect the Astartes from the quakes. He did wonder how many slave mines collapsed from the attack. Acceptable, but unnecessary losses. He would need to have words with his brother. Location: somewhere dank and dark within Ceres. Date: 8/12.M30. 1 hour since the planet quake stopped. Recon squad, astutely of the 9th cohort, crept through the twisting crevice caverns of Ceres' slave pits. Numbering 5 experienced scouts, the squad was commanded by Scout Lieutenant Lyde. They had been tasked with scouting a cavern system their cohort had discovered. Slaves were to be liberated regardless of species. Paths were to be mapped, and Xenoslavers were to be exterminated. The tunnels were dank and cold. Rivets of icy water trickled through cracks in the bedrock, some old, some newly born of the Second Legion's planet quake inducing arrival. Jagged wet stone formed the walls and would tear through human skin like paper. It was a miserable, foul place. Even through his helm's filters, the scout lieutenant could smell the fetid mix of rot, filth, and old machines he associated with places like this. Even after exploring kilometers of tunnel, the squad had not discovered any live humans. Corpses in various stages of decomposition were not uncommon, and a few wandering Curel had been encountered. They had helped teach the scout squad where to strike, to execute them quickly and efficiently. Eventually, though, the faint echoes of human voices filtered through the tunnels. After another kilometer or so of travel, the source of these voices were discovered. Creeping through the shadows like silent giants of grim vengeance, the scouts encountered a pack of human slaves. At least 100 souls ranging from children to barely living elders were chained together and marched forward by a trio of Xenos. Before the Battle Brothers could strike, the chain gang lurched. A diseased, weakened old man slumped over and stopped the slaves' movements. A Qhrel taskmaster scuttled over and discharged welt-bringing bolts of electricity from its weapon tool. The old man thrashed and tried to pull himself to his feet. The years of abuse had taken its toll, and the man could not rise again. Once it realized this, the Xeno unlinked the elder's chain and prepared to dump the crippled slave. The Xeno considered consuming part of the fallen slave, but assumed it would be too diseased to safely consume. As it pondered this, its feeding limbs reached forth. This thought of defilement was what sealed its fate. Just as the Astartes were about to strike, a bloody shriek filled the tunnel. A little girl, no older than 11 Terran years, had detached herself from the chains when they had unbuckled the old man. In her hands was a sharpened bit of metal, and in her heart a lifetime worth of rage. She hurled herself at the slaver and jammed the crude dagger into one of its light-sensitive lobes. Momentary shock filled the chamber as the Xeno keened in agony. Soon, frantic voices echoed through the chamber as other slaves lunged at the Xenos. Whips of energy scorched flesh from bones, and blood-splattered rocks gouged at the Xenos with the near-psychotic fury of the desperate. The tunnel echoed with screams both human and Xeno as the feral carnage continued. A new keening wail spread, and both slaves and masters paused as they recognized the sound. A pack of hunt beasts was scuttling along the walls, coming to assist the Xenos. The slaves started to panic and surged away from the noise. They knew the grotesque pain of the hunt beasts' blood-boiling venom. Yet a group of the younger slaves continued their frantic assault on the Xenos, even as some still attached to the work chain were pulled away. The Astartes watched undetected as a pack of children risked life and limb to ferally attack the Xeno. Even as their elders had run, they continued the assault. As the older slaves tried to drag the children away, the unmistakable noise of a second hunt beast pack filled the tunnel. It was coming from the other direction. Trapped, the work gang started to panic until a girl, the same who had struck the beast first, spoke. "We are going to die. The tunnels are breaking, and a tide of black iron giants rampage through the depths. Our fate is certain, but how we meet it is not. Let us avenge ourselves on the masters of Kyr." Slowly the slaves picked up mining tools and sharpened stone. They knew the girl's words' truth. They had lived as slaves for too long. These youths, each light-touched as the deep witches called those born after the flame ignited, were a different breed than their broken ancestors. Inspired by the children's wrath, the slaves charged, screaming at the closing in Xeno. The girl at the head of the pack. Their charge was met by hungry screeches as the hunt beasts leapt upon their prey. They never reached it. Armored giants seemed to melt out of the shadows. 3 standing between the first pack and the rebels, 2 between the second pack. The Xeno creature was easily the size of the girl and had leapt to sink its teeth into her neck. With one massive hand, Scout Lieutenant Lead caught it and crushed it into paste. In the deep baritone rumble of the Emperor's Angels of Death, he spoke to the girl. After millennia of language drift, she could barely understand it. "Well said, child. Well said." In a storm of iron and blood, the Astartes entered the fray. Power machetes ripped through chitin and xeno flesh with disturbing ease. The muffled thump, ashen pattern assault shock cannons filled the chamber as they dismembered and pulped both hunt beast and Kuril. Lieutenant Lyde weaved between acid-tipped claws and feral lunges. With the practiced ease of a trained hunter, he decapitated the creature and moved on to the next target. Quickly and efficiently, the Astartes cleaved through the Xenos. They were avatars of humanity's. Wrath and death was their art. For the rebels' senses, it was a near instantaneous slaughter. One moment the Xenos were about to butcher them. The next, a pack of giants had appeared, and their former masters and hunters were reduced to smears on the tunnel walls. The first rebel, the girl who had sought to avenge her grandsire, was the first to realize they were now surrounded by the giants. They had committed such violence so quickly and easily. Nothing she could do would save her people from the steel Goliaths. Even so, she would not be a slave. She would die free. Gripping her blood-slick improvised blade, she snarled at the approaching thing. It paused and looked at her through burning red eyes. A deep rumble escaped its steel face. It took her a moment to realize it was laughter. The monster was laughing at her. Slowly, it buckled its weapons to its body and reached up to its head. She gasped as, with a hiss and then a click, the beast removed its head. No, not its head, its helmet. A gasp escaped her lips as she recognized the unmistakably human features revealed. Even enhanced to an incredible size, she knew it was of her species. Slowly, moving to one knee, the giant man looked her in the eyes, and she asked, "Who are you? What are you? And why are you here?" The giant man's face crinkled with a slight smile as he spoke. "I am Scout Lieutenant Lyde. I am a soldier of the Imperium of Man, and we are from ancient Terra, and we have come to take you home." Even with the shivers of transhuman dread twisting her gut, something inside her very soul told the girl salvation had come. Shakily, she asked her final question as she gestured at the corpses of the Xenos. "Are you going to kill all of them?" Placing his helm back on his head, the soldier said, "Yes, in the Emperor's name none shall survive." The girl, whose name was Sanada, smiled a mirthless smile, the smile of victim avenged. She knew not who this emperor was, but the soldier respected him, and he sought brutal justice for her people. That was enough for her young mind. Softly, as she slumped from exhaustion, she spoke. "Good. Location: the core of Ceres. Date: 812.M30. 10 hours since the planet quake stopped. It had been a long, arduous, and strange journey for the 5th cohort. As they had marched deeper and deeper into the rocky dwarf planet, physics had become increasingly distorted. The cohort had reassembled and were preparing to invade the deeper tunnels. The Legion had fully occupied the upper levels of Ceres. They had found a nexus point where numerous tunnels connected and continued in disturbing fashion. The crossroads of the tunnels slopped into great vertical shafts. The tunnels continued down into the dwarf planet. At first, Hawkwood had assumed it was a lift shaft for some elevator or vehicle shaft. Then one of the jump infantry leapt towards the pit, attempting to gauge its depth. To the cohort's shock, the infantry plummeted out of sight. Then the battle brother walked out of the pit, coming over the lip as if it was flat ground. Gravity was distorted. The tunnel did indeed continue down, and gravity accommodated the journey. Carefully, the cohort edged towards the pit and felt the steady shift of gravity. The tunnel floor sloped into the vertical shaft, and gravity followed. With caution, the cohort marched into Ceres' depths. Their augments protected them from the disorientation and nausea such a sudden gravity shift would cause. But even through their hypno-indoctrination, a slight unease crept through the Astartes. Deeper and deeper they delved. They met no resistance, but the sounds of battle started to echo through the tunnel. Hawkwood checked his predator's cogitator and was confused. Data bursts indicated other cohorts had already reached the center of Ceres and were laying siege to the Xeno capital fortress. Yet that battle raging had to be hundreds of kilometers into the deep. Something was distorting space-time to cause this. After an hour or so of travel, the sounds of battle were accompanied by faint flashes of light and the quakes of guns. They were close. The fifth cohort had covered over 300 kilometers of distance in an obscenely short time. Eventually, the tunnel opened up into the heart of Ceres. It was massive, a dozen-kilometer wide, and tall super cavern. Their tunnel path bent with gravity and became part of the cavern floor. Shaped like some sort of titanic cube and dotted with numerous tunnel apertures, the chamber defied all human logic and reason. Each side of the chamber possessed its own gravity. Cohorts of Astartes battled on what Sergeant Hawkwood considered the ceiling and walls. A three-dimensional battle of distorted gravity was being waged over the chamber and its disturbing occupant. Floating in the center of the Titanic room was a Xeno city, a spherical mass of organic architecture that filled the chamber. It was the size of an Imperial cruiser and hung in the air and slowly rotated. Blasts of energy and biological ammunition ripped forth from coral fortresses that dotted it. Swarms of Xeno-defenders lanced forth from non-Euclidean fortresses to strike the assembled forces before falling back. This was the heart of the Quhrel infestation. Sergeant Hawkwood smiled with righteous fury as his tank column formed up alongside its fellows. Like the well-oiled machine they were, the Astartes crew prepared for combat and the order to fire. When it came, they and dozens of Predator tanks fired as one upon the enemy. The armored assets of the Legion poured fire at the Quhrel capital. Cannons saw death, disrupting force fields and smashing spiral battlements. Flak fire ripped scores of Xenos from the air. Bolt gun and blade made quick work of those Xenos unlucky enough to get in range. From all 6 sides of the cube, the Legion attacked. Jet bikes and jump infantry dueled Xeno warriors mid-air as they sought to land upon the floating city. Despite the firepower leveled against it, the fortress held strong. Great gouts of eldritch lighting scoured along the cavern walls, summoned and aimed by pulsating nerve towers that stuck out of the fortress like an oceanic bottom feeder's spines. These bolts were not the slave-breaking tools the invasion force had encountered before. Entire tanks and dozens of battle brothers were vaporized instantly when they struck. Seeking to avoid that fate, the Legion's forces moved constantly, not allowing themselves to bunch up and become an easy target. Even as they moved, they fired, for this offense was simply an elaborate feint. The true offense was coming. With every frantic strafing run that managed to reach the Xeno fortress, the jet bikes of the third formation dropped a unique payload. It was difficult flying in the zone, where the gravity of the chamber flipped, but the benefits outweighed any risk. Dozens of compact advanced teleportation homers plummeted into the Xeno city's gravity. When each homer hit, an alloy spike deployed from its base, locking it into place as it unfolded and called into the warp. These beacons were clever mixtures of Mechanicum skill and Primarch genius, designed to send a signal into the Imperium and form a safe one-way, one-use warp current. The Deep Striker beacons, as they were nicknamed, allowed for a much more accurate and longer-ranged teleportation. Once enough of these beacons were successfully planted, they ignited. Hundreds of spiritual riptides erupted in the Sea of Souls, forming a clear pathway from teleportarium to beacon. Hundreds of Astartes braved the Imperium and arrived in a storm of warp lighting onto the floating city. The first formation had arrived. Composed of the best the other 9 formations had to offer, the first formation was mighty. Terminators and dreadknights thundered forth. Bolt shells and more exotic projectiles cut down the shocked Xeno defenders as they marched. Master duelists and slaughterers carved through the enemy as they hunted for the Kjorl leaders, eager to whet their blades and claim trophy-worthy kills. Each legion and each formation was warfare perfected in its own way, millennia of human knowledge in the art of death applied to their fullest extent. Yet even they paled in face of the first formation. Representatives of each formation fought together, complementing each other's skills perfectly, an unmatchable version of what a legion's mixed chapter should be. The lighting towers were struck quickly and efficiently. Hordes of Xeno defenders were cut down like grain before a scythe. Great weapon banks that fired cancerous projectiles and field generators met their fate at the Astartes' hands. The Kjorl desperately retreated behind tighter and tighter defensive lines, burrowing into the city in frantic attempts to escape the Emperor's wrath. As the first formation spread out and took control of the floating city's surface, some of its librarians and tech marines pried open its secrets. Gravity bridges were created, allowing the forces below to be beamed up to the Xeno city. The siege had reached its next stage. Eldritch barriers bubbled into being. Void coral barriers fossilized over apertures and tunnels shriveled like poisoned veins. These did little to halt the Astartes' advance. Every barrier was carved open, each door blasted apart, as inevitable as the tide they marched. After nearly an hour of frantic fighting, the Xenos had been pushed back to their final stronghold, the true core of Ceres. Below the twisting eldritch architecture of the Kjorl was something else, ancient human metal, It became apparent to the Legion that the Cohorts city was a tumorous addition to the core, an alien metropolis grown around a relic from before Old Night. At the heart of the Xenos city was a mighty gate, an ancient adamantium structure. The Xeno elite had fled behind it, leaving the rest of their ilk to die. The first formation marshaled before the gate, preparing to breach it. As they did, the other Legion elements continued the purge. The Cohorts had committed crimes against the human species. There would be no pity, no remorse, and no fear. Chapter Master Durrandon of the First Formation, 4th Chapter, stood before the Adamantium Gate. His chapter had been ordered to open the gate. So far, nothing had worked. Explosives, focused plasma gouts, melter beams, and even on the few seconds of sustained predator fire had done nothing. Even some of the more esoteric arts of the tech marines and libraries had been ineffective. The only product of these ventures had been a scant bit of information about the barrier that halted them. As the Astartes had suspected, it was of human make. Whatever was beyond it was also the source of the bizarre space-time anomalies that plagued the dwarf planet. The Xenos had found a way to hijack the ancient technology somehow and used it to their advantage. The gate was held strong by some esoteric mix of material and immaterial science. Durrandon doubted anything less than an orbital bombardment could crack the gate. Durrandon sighed as he transmitted the data back to the fleet. Maybe once the rest of the planetoid was captured, heavier equipment could be deployed. Till then, they would secure the gate and assist other forces. At least that was what he planned. An encrypted data burst blipped through Durrandon's comm. It read, "Prepare for high-value assist teleportation. Deep strike code, Lion Knight." The chapter master was momentarily stunned by the message. Recovering quickly, he started barking commands. Deep strike beacons were deployed and every possible angle of attack was covered. They would fight and die to protect the beacons while they did their work. For the Lion Knight was none other than their gene father. The Primarch of the First Legion would be joining the battle. Location: the Type Ridwin in Ceres orbit. Date: 8/12.M30. 14 hours since the planet quake stopped. The fleet battle was going well. The Cohorts were being slaughtered wholesale. 2nd Legion Void Specialists were cleaning out asteroid nests and destroying their fleet. The 2nd Legion and Primarch proved themselves masters of the void, again and again. Eddard Fendragon watched this conquest with mild interest. The vast majority of his transhuman intellect was directed at coordinating the battle below. Even so, he hoped to improve his techniques by watching his brother. The battle for Ceres was going well. Everything was going according to Eddard's projections. He had been starting to wonder if joining the battle personally would even be necessary. A Primarch on the field of battle could win any fight, but one on a command throne could win any war. Even so, he longed for combat, to whet his blade and lead the charge. Then, when the information about the gate reached him, he saw an opportunity. He wanted to test his new sword alongside his legion. In a telepathic pulse, he called out to his honor guard and the legion's first chapter. They were to assemble with him and prepare for insertion. Updates were sent to the fleet's various commanders, and he ceded operational control to his brother. Alexio would end the Void War as he finished the ground one. Leaving the command throne, he headed to his arming chamber. The armor he wore was a light suit, designed to protect from hull breaches or boarding assaults, not something a Primarch would wear on the battlefield. Automatically, a chapter master of the 8th Formation took Eddard place at the TIE Pridwen's helm as he left. For this battle, he would be armed and armored with his favorite equipment. The arming servants and servitors had already gathered it. Standing in the center of his arming chamber, Eddard allowed the mechanical arms to remove his light armor and prepare his war gear. First was a suit of armor that was neither standard power armor nor Terminator, akin to his father's and the Custodes in design. Its auramite was obsidian black, with only its trim maintaining the original golden luster. In every way, it was beyond the standard plate of the Legion. Artificial muscles strengthened the Primarchs might even further. Auramite plates could stop all but the harshest blows. Sensors and psychic interfaces filled the helm. A unique hybrid field generator known as the Nemean Halo would protect from all but the most brutal directed energy attacks. This was fastened to an enhanced backpack power unit that could feed on Eddard's psychic might if need be. It lacked the ornateness of some of his other armors or of what some of his brothers would wear into battle. That suited the firstborn just fine. It was utilitarian, efficient, and yet still beautiful in the same way a master-crafted blade was, perfect for his uses. The only decoration it possessed came in the form of its Legion markings, the Emperor's own sigil in place of a rank, an honor awarded only to the Primarchs, Valdor, and Tyrannus, and a lion head crest on its breastplate. The armor itself had not been named yet. It was known simply as the Black Plate to those who knew of it. The Titan sword was firmly attached to his left hip by an ancient scabbard, also taken from the Sigillite's vault. The sword was bound to his very soul. In the short time he had owned it, the blade had become an extension of the Primarch's being. He was eager to test it on the field of battle. Above the blade on his hip was the Primarch's left arm, and on it his other weapon. All sons at some point, consciously or subconsciously, mimic their father. Eddard was no different. The left arm of Black Plate was a massive power claw. With sword in one hand and claw in other, the Imperium's Black Knight looked the umbric image of his father. Unlike his father's golden talons, Eddard's power claw was built to mimic the claws of some gigantic feline. The armored gauntlet was bulky like his father's, a mass of auramite and adamantium that housed archaic mechanisms. Its hulking fingers ended in atom-sharp claws that could ignite with crackling energy. Underneath the claw's forearm was a built-in underslung plasma weapon, a unique creation of the Primarch known as the Lionfire. Designed for tactical flexibility, both its fusion core and electromag field generator could be easily manipulated, allowing Eddard to choose what sort of projectile it fired, from streams of superheated gas burning like a flamer to super-contained bolts of energy that broke through their magnetic cage once they had punctured a foe's armor. Eddard was psychically powerful, but could not automatize a Xeno champion with a thought like the Emperor. Instead, a gout of plasma would make do. The last piece of war gear to come online was a gift from Caleb and Culain. It was a shield fitting of the Emperor's blade. It was not a bulky storm shield or anything of the sort. Built into Eddard's massive power claw was a single ornate gem. Easily the size of a mortal man's head, was a wonder of psionic and barrier technology. The Ebony Grail, a device that combined miniaturized Mechanicum Knight, ion shield technology, and telekine barriers. With a thought, Eddard could summon an energy field powered by his armor, and his mind capable of stopping a Lascanon shot. When activated, a golden black shield composed of runes and esoteric energy ignited over his arm and covered his entire left flank in a shimmering field. The only way it was inferior to its Questa-mounted kin was its inability to be moved. A Martian Knight's ion shield could be moved independently to deflect incoming projectiles. The Ebony Grail acted much more like a traditional shield and moved with its bearer. Armed and armored, the Primarch let his consciousness expand into his arms and armor. The neural ports in his spine allowed a far better connection than his gene son's carapace. With a subsonic hum, the armor came to life, and the Primarch peered through his helm's lenses. The Emperor's sword left his arming chamber and prepared to join the fight. The 24 greatest members of the First Legion met their Primarch at his personal teleportarium. Wearing modified cataphractii Terminator armor and wielding an assortment of weapons, they would fight and die for their gene father. They were his honor guard, the Black Crown. Together, both Astartes and Primarch would join the battle. Elsewhere within the Tai Pridwen, the rest of Eddard's personal chapter prepared to teleport. They were the Knights of the Crown, the first chapter of the first formation. Eddard felt his sons' battle lust and excitement wane as they focused. The Astartes tapped into deep hypno-indoctrination and corralled their emotions. Plunging through the Imperium with hearts burning hot would attract malicious attention. Many a warrior had been plucked from the safe warp channel of a teleportation, thanks to their souls calling out to the warp's predators. Standing at the center of the teleportation, with his honor guard forming a circle around him, Eddard addressed the fleet. "We salvation for our kin, damnation for our foes. The First Legion started this battle, and we shall end it. Thy will be done. As it is on Terra, so it shall be here." With that, the signal was sent to the fourth chapter, and the deep strike beacons flared into life. The skein of reality was peeled back. The Primarch and his chosen entered the warp. Riding the river of light that cut through the warp's battle-born froth, the Legion's elite rode the current through the battle-filled void and the frozen bedrock of Ceres straight into the heart of the Xeno city. A moment after the Tai Pridwen's teleportarium flared, the first Primarch and his elite arrived before the adamantium gate in a flare of warp lighting. Arriving like the myth champions of ancient Nordic Bifrost sagas. They were glorious, armored in gold and obsidian. At the head of this epic spear tip was the firstborn of the Emperor, the sword against the darkness, Lord of the First Legion, the young King of Lions, Eddard Fendragon. the Emperor's Knight. Chapter Master Durrandon knelt before his Gene-sire, and his subordinates followed. With emotion, the Primarch permitted them to rise. Durrandon started to apologize for his incompetence, requiring the Primarch's presence. A firm, power-armored hand touched his Jennison's shoulder, and words of reassurance were given to him and the other Astartes stationed before the gate. Not being able to open it was not a failure. They simply lacked the right tools. That was why he had come, to supply his sons with the right tool. "What tool could break down this bastion, my lord?" Durrandon asked. Unsheathing his ancient blade and igniting it with a crackle, the Primarch advanced towards the gate while speaking, "The Emperor's sword." Gesturing for his sons to back away, the Primarch approached the gate. When he was about half a sword's length away, the Primarch stooped and examined it. A Warhound Titan could comfortably walk through the giant door, and Eddard imagined if he had not been present, firepower equivalent to one of those war machines would have been necessary. With a thought, Eddard's left gauntlet shifted. Its great adamantium claws retracted and shifted. The massive fist retracted into the forearm, forming an odd buckler of metal around the ebony Grail's gem center. Freed from the bulky power claw, his left hand matched his right. As the first and fourth chapters of the Legion's elite watched, the Primarch gripped the Titan sword with both hands, holding it with poise, and himself with perfect stance. Eddard focused his mental energies. This sort of singular EI strike was more the forte of his third and fifth brother, but he was a Primarch. Every martial skill he had been taught, he had mastered. Raising the blade high above his head, Eddard expanded his senses, both supernatural and superhuman. The gate was held shut by countless mechanisms, stasis locks, gravitic reinforcements, arcane warding, molecular bonds insulated by eldritch energies, force fields of both human and alien make. It was a bizarre hybrid, human, xeno, natural, supernatural. Despite this, it would fall. With a single strike, the Titan sword and the Primarchs will cleave the ancient archaic mechanisms. Few beings in the known universe match the physical and psychic potential of a Primarch. In particular, the superhuman willpower of the Emperor's sons was almost beyond compare. That willpower, when channeled through a warp-resonant soul, could alter the fabric of the universe in a form of psychic mastery. This was not the crude warp craft of sorcerers and psychers who called upon warp predators or their own volatile souls to power their arts. This was the anathema's way. Force of will dominated the warp and wielded it. Reliant on the psycher's willpower, only the most powerful and confident warp-touched could wield it. Eddard Fendragon commanded the warp, and it obeyed. Immaterial energy flowed through the Primarch and coursed into his blade. In less than a moment, the gate's mechanisms were sliced clean through. Matter, energy, space-time. No matter the barrier's source, it was cleaved. For the power wielded by the Primarch was far more primal and beyond the multiverse's material workings. A roll of thunder echoed through Ceres' core, and the gate was thrust open by the blow. Now came the final assault. Raising his sword above his head, the Primarch let loose a battle cry that reverberated through the air and warp. "Thy will be done." With that, Eddard led his sons into Ceres' heart. The rancid core of the infestation awaited the Emperor's sword. Location: Inner Sanctum of High Prelate Nalrak Au. Date: 8 to 12.M30. 15 hours since the planet quake stopped. High Prelate Nalrak Au was the wealthiest and therefore most powerful Curel within the Ceres slave colony. Its clan had been one of the original founders, and they had profited greatly from humanity's fall. For nearly 1,000 Seer rotations, the Curel had been fortunate. In a single day, those fortunes had been utterly reversed. A horde of mutant meatlings of seemingly Terran origin had invaded. Every defense and force the Curel could desperately summon was smashed aside. Naalrak Au could only watch through the inner sanctum of the steel flesh sensor arrays as doom came to its people. Entire clans were scoured away in belligerent fire, millennia of history and thousands of Curel butchered. The High Prelate could only ooze pheromones of horror and grief as chem sensors howled that the prime breeding pools had been drained. The polyp spawn had been burned alive as they suffocated. Even some of Nalrak Au's latest siring has been murdered. It had been thankful to secure the safety of most of its clan within the steel flesh of Ceres. The ancient relic was impregnable. It did not matter that the rest of Ceres' people and resource had to be abandoned. As long as they held the heart, they could wait. Naalrak Au's clan. The Naalrak in near its entirety was clustered deep within the bunker nests built into the eldritch metal. Entire kin units preparing to enter hibernation. An exoskeleton crew of Curel would stand guard over their kin as long as it took for the invaders to leave. This method had worked before, and the elite of the Naalrak clan hoped it would work again. For a few precious hours, it appeared it would. The mutant meatlings were running out of things to smash and burn. Their attempts to breach the steel flesh had so far failed. Right as Naalrak Au started to settle and allow itself to hope, a new nether tier was detected. A large force had stepped between realities and now stood outside the gate. Before the Curel Elder could check the other gravitic and witch sensors for more information, a great thundering blast echoed through the steel flesh. As it shook, the Xenofortress Au felt something great and terrible that every species knew and feared, the dreaded feeling of an apex predator's attention. It faded as soon as it came, and Naalrak Au felt the stench of fear pheromones leaking from its ducts. Shaking itself back to stability, the Xeno was shocked and confused. The Curel knew no predators. They had driven such creatures extinct millions of years ago on their home world. Naalrak Au barely had time to regain a little composure when the alert glands of the inner sanctum began expelling news of the worst-case scenario. The entrance to the steel flesh had been breached. Utter dread filled the High Prelate. It could already sense the deaths of the first defenders, slaughtered by some terrible monster the Terrans had unleashed. Nothing could stop this. Panicking slightly, the Curel closed off every gate and unleashed every defense available. It knew this would do little more than buy time. Time to unleash something the founding members of the Ceres colony had buried. The steel flesh core of Ceres was more than a bunker and command center for the Curel colony. It was also a vault, a place where wealth, treasures, weapons, and horrors could be kept safe. It could be sealed away from outside threats or lock up things that should never have existed. The first and most terrible item in this collection was the very reason the Naalrak clan ruled Ker as first among equals, an ancient artifact from a previous era of Kurel history. This weapon was far too powerful to control and beyond the understanding of the Xenos' current sciences. Even so, the threat it possessed and the danger of its activation kept them in control. Now the time had come to activate it. Frantically, Naalrak-Au scuttled into the deepest vault. Tucked away behind layers of Terran steel and Kurel energy barriers was a stasis field of phenomenal potency, a vice grip on space-time, protecting its occupant from the passage of time and the universe from its malice. To human eyes, it would have appeared a single massive diamond. A more careful observer would have realized it was no mere bauble. It was easily the size of a mortal man's head and bedecked with countless scriptures of warding. Trembling slightly, the High Prelate started the process of deactivating the stasis field, all while praying to its pantheon for salvation. Naalrak-Au knew it would perish in this endeavor. In fact, most of the steel flesh's occupants would as well. Once this thing was unleashed, it would form a tide of devastation that would sweep through Cher. As its main manipulators and sensors worked to unlock the artifacts, wards, its secondary sets worked to open and shut the various apertures and tunnels in the core. If Naalrak-Au could give the abomination a path of least resistance towards the invaders, it would leave its kin alone. With a little luck, the nightmare tide would sweep up through Ceres and drive the invaders back. The artifact would be destroyed. The Terran fleet would ensure that. Yet, if it could do enough damage, the meatlings would be driven back and quarantine the planet, letting the Kurel hibernate for as long as they needed. It was beyond risky, but if it succeed, at least some of Clan Au would survive. The High Prelate's book gills rattled with tension as the last bindings dissolved. The stasis field flickered out of being, and time caught up to the artifact. For a moment, the oily green diamond hung in the air as the ancient consciousness inside it awoke. A ripple shimmered along its perfect geometric edges. A voice in the nether punched into Naalrak-Au's mind. Its scream sang, begged the dread call of the abomination's kind. Tekelili, Tekelili. That was the last thing Naalrak-Au ever sensed as the ancient servant tool detonated into a mass of hungry flesh and consumed it. In far distant eons, at their species' height, the Kurel had sought to create the ultimate slave, a species that would serve perfectly and do any duty, using nether-spawned mutants as the basis of the work they had succeeded for a time. An ever-shifting mass of flesh and matter that could take any shape and follow any order. Like so many other species that dive too deep and too greedily into the nether domain, the fruits of this labor were poisoned. For the Eldar, it was the birth of she who thirsts. For the Kinabrach, it was the living decay of Nurglite apathy. The Kurel's folly came in the form of a slave revolt. The Shoggoth insurrection. After nearly 100,000 years of unending conflict in the dark and dank parts of the universe, the Kurel triumphed. The Shoggoths were nearly driven to extinction, and their former masters recovered, willingly giving up the powers that had made them mighty, and relying only on the most tested and faithful sciences. The Kurel retreated to the universe's corners. growing rich and happy, feeding off the labor of lesser slaves. The only reminders of the cataclysmic servant tool revolt were fear sagas to tell the spawnlings and a few prisoners of the war. For the mightiest of the Shoggoths could not be killed by the Curel, only imprisoned and sealed away. That was what High Prelate Narak Ahu had unleashed. Nearly 100,000 tons of ever-shifting mutant flesh had been compressed into a living diamond. Those seals that kept it trapped in that shape were now gone. A living tide of flesh poured forth. Gallons of hungry mouths roared through the tunnels, searching for enemies to kill and matter to feed on. It was ancient. It was unstoppable. It was a living nightmare. The Shoggoth was the ultimate product of Curel science and sorcery. To any mortal man, it was doom in flesh. To the firstborn of the anathema, it was prey. Location: somewhere inside the mechanical heart of Ceres. Date: 812.M30. 43 minutes and 12 seconds since the fall of the Ceres gate. Eddard Fendragon felt a shift in the warp. Some great and terrible presence bloomed into being. A body and soul to swallow the world erupted, screaming for vengeance and flesh. Quickly, the Primarch sent a series of telepathic and vox communiques to the other strike force commanders. The Primarch led the main thrust with various lieutenants splitting off as they drove deeper into the floating city. Xeno defenders had put up little fight. The bizarre architecture and gravitational anomalies, in truth, proved to be a bigger danger. The Curel seemed to only have a tentative level of control over the heart's gravitational abilities. It was still enough to generally impede and harass the Astartes. So the frantic order to retreat came as a surprise to the Astartes. Advancing so far had been difficult and tedious. If it had come from anyone other than their Primarch, the legionaries might have questioned it. The first formation quickly moved towards the broken gate as the Primarch and his honor guard moved deeper into the bizarre relic city. They traveled along a direct thoroughfare that had opened up when the presence was unleashed. It had been obscured from the Astartes by gravitational twists and turns. Now, free of those oddities, it formed a straight path from the gate to the inner sanctum of the Xeno infestation. It did not take the Primarch's transhuman genius to understand something was being aimed at him. The black circlet honor guard took formation and waited. With a thought, the ebony grail shield flickered into being, and the Primarch raised his sword and shield in preparation. They did not have to wait long. An epic gale poured down the tunnel, a mass of air being pushed forward by a huge object. The wind's roar was soon matched by another. 1,000 mouths and vocal cords, grown singularly to issue this challenge, let loose a defining clarion call. The tunnel was easily 24 meters wide and tall. The oncoming flood filled it entirely, a wall of mutant flesh that gushed down the tunnel. Mouths, eyes, and other more unknowable organs and orifices formed the wall. It barreled forward, the raw, destructive power of such sheer momentum and mass enough to flatten a mechanicum Nightwalker. Moving at speeds even an Astartes' vision could not track, the Primarch charged the oncoming storm. The Ebony Grail's energy field widened and took the brunt of the impact. Nightmarish flesh boiled away as it crashed into the force field. Whispering psionic mantras, the Emperor's son gathered huge amounts of warp power. The Imperium flowed through the Primarch's muscles, enhancing and protecting his body from the strain of blocking the Shoggoth. The name of the creature became known to the Primarch when they clashed. Its identity and its dread cry of Tekelili was screamed into the Imperium. The thing was utterly mad and extremely dangerous. Despite, or because of this, Eddard Fendragon was grinning savagely. This would be his first dragon to slay, a mighty foe to test himself against. The Emperor's sword would strike the beast down, and it would be the first among countless. Telekinetic force enough to reduce an Astartes company to a wet stain was used to bolster the Primarch. Waves of mental energy pushed back at the beast, yet the Primarch was still losing ground. Slowly but surely, he was being pushed back. The scrape of his sabatons along the metal floor added to the cacophony of creatures' hisses. The energy fields crackle and the black circlets fire. Bolts of plasma, volkite rays, and exotic bolt shells volleyed around the Primarch, slamming into the flesh tide and alleviating the transhuman champion's burden the smallest amount. Dragon and Dragon Slayer clashed. The Primarch snarled under the pressure like a great feline, dueling its rival for control of the pride. Reaching out with his warp sight, the Primarch realized the true bulk of the creature. He was only facing down a tendril of it. To defeat the Shoggoth, the Imperium's apex predator would be unleashed. The Primarch voxed his sons, a simple order to protect them from the beast's wrath and the Primarch's fury. All units retreat to the surface and wait. If I do not return within 6 hours, prepare to implement the ultimate sanction. The Legion was shocked. What sort of horror could their Primarch have encountered to warrant such a thing? Nearly 100 Astartes librarians delved into Ceres' core astrally to find the answer the moment the order came through. One went insane. 31 were comatose for anywhere for an hour to a week, and the rest came back screaming about a mountain of flesh hungry for souls. The Astartes left the core of Ceres, all heading to the various occupied fortress built into the crust. They would let the Emperor's sword fight, but they would not abandon their Genofather. The Legion was poised and ready to hold the line against the horror if it broke through the Primarch. The last to leave were the Black Circlet. It took a direct psychic order from the Primarch to get the honor guard to evacuate. Each and every one of them wanted to fight and die alongside the Primarch. It was only when the knowledge that their presence would hamper their Genefather's chances of surviving the fight was hammered into their brains did they finally retreat. Once they and the rest of the First Legion were to safety, the battle could truly begin. Eddard was surrounded. The honor guard had had to blast their way through various corrupt tendrils to escape, and now those writhing waves of tainted meat were closing in. The Shoggoth's great lumbering intellect was focused on the Primarch fully. It had focused on surrounding and consuming him over escaping. For such a being, absorbing a Primarch would bring about an apotheosis of evolution. Despite its great age and experience, the Shoggoth did not see it was playing into the Primarch's hands. It had not learned from its mistakes in the insurrection, and greedily coveted the secrets of the anathema. Masses of twisted flesh poured down both ends of the corridor, pinning the Primarch between itself. As the second front of the tide edged closer to the Black Knight, his stance changed. A wave of telekine force pushed the mass that pressed against his shield back just a little bit and gave him an opening. The ebony chalice force field simmered into nothingness, and its golden glow was replaced with the light of the Primarch's weapons. The Titan's sword ignited, its blade becoming a solid mass of purifying white-hot light. Psychically imbued claws crackled with disruptor energy, and the Lionfire plasma weapon readied itself. A stream of plasma, funneled in a vague cone by electromagnetic bindings, poured into the original tendril wall. Enhanced and controlled by the Primarch's pyrokinesis, it atomized the Shoggoth on contact. Soon, the very walls of the tunnel started to run molten and burnt as flickering lashes of plasma fire licked across it. With his left hand pouring death into the original flesh tide, the Emperor's sword struck with his own weapon into the second wall of Shoggoth. Where the blade touched, the creature died. Ever-mutating cells popped into sparks of plasma if they were so much as caressed by the sword's energy. With only a single hand and reduced mobility, Eddard kept the ambushing beast at bay, moving faster than the Imperium should have allowed. The blade was everywhere the Shoggoth was. Soulfire, disruptor energy, and a perfect killing edge erased it into unliving atoms. Adjusting slightly, the Primarch let the Shoggoth creep closer and closer. Whirling about, he unleashed sword and flame on both tendrils, becoming a maelstrom of destruction, striking faster and faster in a smaller and smaller radius. Eddard Fendragon slashed and burned, drawing the full attention of the monster to himself. A steady layer of base elements that had once been the Shoggoth's flesh coated the walls of the chamber, the metal growing blacker and blacker from plasma, fire, and ash. Reaching out mentally, the Primarch could feel the creature diverting its flesh to strike him. Tendrils that had originally probed the heart's reaches, searching for escape, were now being added to the bulk attacking him. On and on the deadly duel continued, the Primarch's killing storm becoming a sphere of extinction. Everything from semi-liquid living acid to organic diamond spines seeking his heart was destroyed. The Titan sword was everywhere at once, and accompanied by the Lionfire's wrath, the Primarch battled. Feeling the titanic body and mind of the Shoggoth utterly devoted to the battle, he smiled. Every last inch of the Shoggoth was dedicated to ending him. With that certainty, Eddard Fendragon let out a triumphant roar. Now the day would be his. The Lionfire increased in intensity tenfold, as most of the Primarch's power pack's output was pushed into the unique plasma weapon. The walls of flesh could not press through the inferno, even as the Titan sword halted its dance of doom. The black plate could not maintain this for long, but the Primarch did not need long. A few moments of concentration were all he needed. The Primarch's willpower reached out into the warp and touched the reflection of his sword. The Titan blade, like so many legendary weapons, dwelt in both material and immaterial, for its legend and nature made it an object of both domains. Dominating and grasping both sword and dream of sword, the Primarch prepared to strike the ultimate blow. Eddard Fendragon unleashed a technique that was the pinnacle of the four sword arts. The blade became a conduit into the warp, a warp rift in the shape of a sword. The connection between the sword and sword legend became a bridge into the Sea of Souls, forming a distort weapon of unimaginable potency. The silver blade became as black as the void, no longer a sword's killing edge, but a psychic black hole, forged into the shape-up idea of a blade. Time slowed as the Primarch focused, searching for the greatest concentration of the Xeno monster's flesh, watching the tides of flesh ripple and roll until the opportunity presented itself. With the blackened Titan blade, the Emperor's sword struck. Thrusting it forward, the sword's distort rift/blade expanded, becoming longer and longer as the material veil was split. For a moment, the material universe struggled to understand what now existed within the tunnel, a mile-long gash in existence that both began at and was the Titan blade. Once the universe settled and the laws of physics could interpret the rift, doom was unleashed. Everything that came in contact with the blade rift ceased to exist. Ripped between the laws and domains of the material and immaterial, a normal distort weapon would have stopped there. The technique the Primarch had invented and named the Strike Dolorous was far, far more destructive. So much so, he had needed his sons to leave him for fear of damaging his legion more than his enemy. Ungravity of the warp dragged the Shoggoth's mountainous flesh into the rift, a spiritual event horizon that hungered eternally. The Primarch held himself perfectly still, focusing every ounce of his willpower into controlling the Titan sword. If he failed and let the rift break from his control, it would sputter and leave him to the Shoggoth, or far more horribly, open up a screaming chasm into the farthest reaches of the deep warp. Ton after ton of mutating frantic meat was pulled into the immaterial, shackled together by tendons and chemical bonds. The creature fought with every ounce of its being to pull itself free. Clawed and fanged tendrils lashed at the Primarch, cracking his armor, desperate to pierce his flesh and claim his soul. Eddard paid them no heed as his mind dived deeper and deeper into the immaterial. He plunged his consciousness and his sword into the darkest, most impossible reaches of the warp, making the conduit a mightier and more terrible thing. The Shoggoth's very mind, body, and soul was pulled into the deep warp, where the congealed stuff of unborn universes erased it utterly. This struggle of wills continued for an uncountable period of time. The rift twisted space-time itself, making time pass strangely in those twisted, flesh-filled tunnels. Fendragon himself did not know if the battle had lasted seconds or centuries. All he knew was he must outlast the abomination. Even as a fleshy, diamond-tipped drill tendril cut its way through one of his armor's knee joints and into his flesh, he paid it no heed. Rasping miniature maws gouged away at the flesh of his leg, seeking to pain him enough to break the rift. Still, he stood strong as molecular acids designed to maim, while keeping nerves alive enough to suffer pumped through his bloodstream. Mastercrafted biology battled alien insanity as the Primarch and Shoggoth dueled. The duel was fought on the countless battlefield, from the Sea of Souls to the individual tendons of the Black Knight's calf. Slowly but surely, the creature was fed into the warp, dragged out of its nests and burrows in Ceres like a parasite being excised. It frantically tried to plant elements of itself in untouched crevices, disconnecting itself and hoping to survive the warp's hunger even if its main body did not. To the monster's terror, this was not enough. its soul was also being consumed by the rift, dragging its consciousness into the pit, leaving its protected flesh caches without a mind, reducing them to puddles of inert protoplasm. The assault on the Primarch intensified as toothed tendrils ripped his flesh apart from the inside. Organs were punctured, muscles ripped, bones burrowed into. Psychic power kept the Primarch standing. Finally, the struggle started to come to its close. Shoggoth tendrils, burrowed deep into Eddard, started to be pulled taut. Digging in with spurs and barbs, it fought to keep its hold on the Primarch's flesh. But the Shoggoth was quickly running out of material. Over 90% of its body had been sucked into the warp, and it lacked the matter to continue the attack. The Shoggoth howled in desperation as its clawed feelers were pulled out of the Primarch. Eddard bore the mind-breaking pain with stoicism as the creature was pulled out of his wounds. At last, the Shoggoth's entire body was dragged into the warp. 100,000 tons of ancient horror was dragged into the warp, screaming and thrashing the entire while. With a final desperate howl, the monster was pulled fully and finally into the warp. Now the true battle began. Roaring with stress, the Primarch fought to dominate the warp and keep the rift from growing. He pulled himself out of the nightmarish domain of the multiverse's innards and back to the Sea of Souls surface. Breaching and returning to the domain of sanity and certainty, the Emperor's sword sealed the rift shut. The black nothingness shrunk and shrunk until it was gone. Finally, all that was left was the Titan's sword. Its nothingness blade slowly faded as the psychic energies summoned to rip open space/time were used to seal it. Time returned to its normal progression, and the Titan sword's blade once again became the mythic silver it was supposed to be. The only evidence of the rift or the Shoggoth was the bizarre grooves left where it had been erased from, and a few puddles of primordial ooze awaiting collection and study by the Margot biologists. In truth, Eddard Fendragon did not know how much time had passed during the duel, but his armor's chronometer indicated about 2 hours had gone by for the rest of the universe. Exhaling deeply, the Primarch attempted to sheath his blade. Only then did he allow himself to feel the mind-racking pain his body was experiencing. Catastrophic internal damage nearly caused him to topple over from the simple act of returning his sword to its scabbard. His mind utterly exhausted from the effort of the strike dolorous, and his body, ravaged by the Shoggoth Eddard Fendragon, allowed himself to slump to his knees. Despite all the suffering and stress he had endured, the Primarch was proud. He was the Emperor's sword, pointed at humanity's foes, and today he had struck down his first true foe. Throwing his head back and letting loose a triumphant roar through bloody cracked lips, Eddard Fendragon celebrated his victory. The primal shout that echoed from his mouth and mind reverberated through the mechanical heart of Ceres and the waiting Astartes' minds. To all who heard, felt it, the meaning was obvious. They were triumphant. Rapidly, the first formation returned to Ceres' heart and found their Primarch. The Emperor's Knight had managed to heal partially. Anathema taught biomancy, and their Genocide's own formidable augments had stopped the bleeding. Organs were being patched, muscles rinned, and toxins were contained and excised. Despite the wishes of the Black Circlet, Eddard Fendragon insisted on leading his sons till the conclusion of the battle. Together they marched into the farthest reaches of Ceres, through tunnels and chambers distorted by the unmaking fury of the Primarch and the Shoggoth's fleshy detonation. The legionaries were surprised to discover vast parts of the relic fortress untouched by the Shoggoth, as if something had steered it away from these gates and doors. High Prelate Nalrak Au had succeeded in guiding the Shoggoth away from his kin. It did little good for them. They would have been swallowed instantly by it. The Imperium would not grant them such a peaceful fate. The few remaining guards were butchered by the first formation, and their charges were left vulnerable. Over 1,000 Curol hibernation pods had been built into these hidden chambers, along with countless technological and cultural relics to help them restart their fetid civilization. Knightmaster Landuin, the second selected of the Black Circlet, raised his plasma pistol to burn the sleeping Xenos. Eddard stopped him, was emotion, and ordered the contents of the room to be presented to the Adeptus Terra and Mars for their purposes. Technological and biological secrets would be pried from the Curel and their artifacts. The foulest looking would be used in public executions and show trials, allowing humanity to see the enemy and know they could be killed. Brutal justice for the freed slaves would be extracted. Deeper still into Ceres was a collection of Golden Age human relics, machines of gravity and time that stymied even the Primarch's intellect. Musing to himself, Eddard wondered how much favor he could curry with the Mechanicum when the contents of these hidden vaults were handed over. At long last, the entirety of Ceres and the inner belt of Sol was cleansed. In a few days, the First and Second Legion and effectively subjected a region of valuable territory that would have taken even the finest of the unification troops months to crack, while maintaining its resources, usefulness, and protecting human civilians. Something the Thunder Warriors had never been good at. Bloody and battered, but still regal and strong. Eddard Fendragon returned to the TIE Pridwen and announced to the legions and Imperium in general that the Battle of Ceres was over.